Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. So, ever wondered how crunch can lead to 70% of a department leaving? Well, today's the video. Last year's delay of The Last of Us 2 was disappointing, but it was ultimately rather understandable. Naughty Dog needed more time to finish that game, and most people thought, yeah, cool, fair enough, we want a good game. More time, though, for the people working on it quickly turned into more crunch, and when the game finally releases in May, many Naughty Dog staffers are going to be asking themselves whether it was worth it, and many of them are going to leave the company. And it really does seem like the brain drain of Naughty Dog is going to hurt them long into the future. Now, if you're new here then, hello, we're a narrative game studio. If you want to hit up our mailing list, check out our site, that's down below. We also do 5 to 6 game industry analysis videos per week, so sub for more of those. And if you want to help us out with the algorithm, which truly does help, then any likes and comments letting us know what you think are super appreciated. And with that, let's get into the video. So, Jason Schreier published an article delving into the culture of crunch at Naughty Dog, crunch that actually stands out even within the games industry. Now, this is a studio that is built on a culture of perfectionism, just promoting that pursuit of quality at absolutely any cost. One anonymous staffer told Schreier that this game is really good, but at a huge cost to the people. Current and former employees alike cited that while the studio does try to look after its staff, they are obliged to, quote, get the job done. Which, I mean, get the job done does make sense for a job, but it's, you know, the realistic situation here that people are actually saying they're kind of forced into, that's really the problem. It's not really getting your work done, it's what that actually means and how it's really going beyond the scope of what a regular job should be. So for their part, Naughty Dog does provide free dinners during crunch time and stuff like that to try to alleviate problems, but many staff actually just report being too busy to even think about eating. Now, salaried workers aren't actually paid overtime for doing overtime, but they can get extra bonuses once the game ships. As for the contractors, well, they're not eligible for the bonuses, but they can get pay bumps, 1.5x for over 8 hours and 2x for over 12 hours. Now, this prolonged culture of crunch, it can really have like profound consequences on staff retention, and this is important for a company. Think about, say, BioWare. Now, Schreier reports that of the 20 non-lead designers on Uncharted 4, only 6 are at the studio. That's a drop-off rate of 70%, and they say that's had a knock-on impact on development. Naughty Dog had to hire a disproportionately, this is a quote, disproportionately high number of juniors and contractors, and their lack of experience added to the weight of an already hefty workflow. And apparently, right, they actually burnt through people in the games industry because game people didn't want to go near Naughty Dog, and they ended up getting animation juniors and staff from the film world. Now, that ended up causing a whole bunch of problems because there's a lot of video game specific stuff in a video game animation workflow that's, yeah, you know, these film people, they were doing their best, but at the end of the day, they were just experienced in a slightly different field. And that, again, is something that delayed this game and made it harder for people to get their work done, of course, meaning, I guess, less quality and more crunch. I mean, seriously, if you're doing a studio, like, you are your staff. They're the people actually doing the stuff. It's the most important thing. So to have 70% attrition for a team is wild. Now, apparently new staff found it very challenging to meet the standards expected by the studio because of all those things, and this is not something that's helped by a management culture that is geared towards only providing people feedback if it's negative. Basically, at Naughty Dog, no news is good news, and this leads to a lot of confusion, and it's why the studio is typically quite averse to hiring juniors, but their hand was forced because of all the departures. Some of the leavers were also never replaced, with the remaining workers just having to pick up the slack for the people who were gone and were not replaced, or if they were replaced, you know, would have been with a less experienced person. So, will these departures continue after release, right? Some devs told Schreier that they plan to quit as soon as their bonuses come in, around 6 months after release. Now, losing more staff will mean that the next project is going to encounter all the same problems, but probably worse, like overwhelming workloads, inexperienced juniors, having your like strong institutional talent being eroded, and yes, even more crunch. The studio, I think, needs to learn from their mistakes here. They need to change their philosophy from the top down, because if this stuff continues, then Naughty Dog will literally eat itself alive. Now, ineffective management as a thing just seems to be one of the main issues over there. They've got this lack of top-down communication that can actually result in a massive amount of wasted work. As an example, a designer might spend a whole bunch of effort effort working in a scene only to realize that it had been cut. And they might not even find that out for weeks, and that will of course mean wasted time and lower morale. I mean, it almost reminds me of like the Imperium for Warhammer 40k, where like, you know, a clerical error could just mean that a world is forgotten about for a few hundred years. It seems like that's what it would be like, you know, working under these sort of weird conditions with no proper production team. Now, on those staff issues, well, contradictions in the game's direction has also been a really major issue for them. Schreier actually recounts a situation during Uncharted 4's development over basically a particular scene and whether that scene should have guards in it or not. And that actually led to weeks of wasted work for 3 people, which is obviously an inefficient way to use your people. Basically, it's all a lack of organization, and things like this, I mean, the problem is, right, this is normally what a production team deals with. Producers are so important. They run the show, they manage workloads, they communicate across departments, they ensure that everyone's on the same page, that goals are met, that the ship is running smoothly, and, you know, they also do things like reminding staff to take breaks, ideally. Naughty Dog, though, doesn't have a production team. Yes, the studio's philosophy is that everyone should act as their own producer. Now, this can be creatively freeing, yes, it can allow artists to spend, you know, time working on those little flares, right, in a game that really does make, say, Naughty Dog's games feel quite unique. So that's the pro, but the con is that it can lead to very, very inefficient work, an unorganized project, and lots of wasted time, and that is bad for quality. I mean, undertaking any project, even the scope of one that we'd be doing, would be insane without a producer, and I mean, yeah, that's like, never mind something as big as The Last of Us 2, a massive game. Now, Naughty Dog are clearly confident in their methods, right? It's how they've always done things from what we understand, but it doesn't make those methods any less absurd, and I think it is going to hurt them. Now, in a response to the article, Jonathan Cooper, who basically worked as an animator at Naughty Dog for 6 years, wrote on Twitter that the studio actually tried to withhold his final paycheck from him, which is a real dick move. They then allegedly pressured him into signing paperwork to confirm that he wouldn't discuss their production-related practices, but that they relented when he assured them that that was most likely an illegal thing for them to ask. Cooper writes that for The Last of Us 2's September demo, the animation department crunched, quote, more than he'd ever seen and required, quote, weeks of recovery afterwards. He also then takes aim at what he calls the junior-senior ratio, claiming that a more senior team would have shipped the game a year ago. It's just that look behind the curtain, really, at a studio that's set in its ways for better or worse, and obviously here we're seeing the worst. And that's just Jonathan. There are a whole bunch of other people who have came out on Twitter talking about their experiences working for the company, and they pretty much all just sort of fall on those lines. Now, the emphasis on self-production is something that often clashes with the need for managerial oversight at the company. Staff are expected to be in control of their own workflow, but well, projects still need to be signed off from managers. Now, one designer reported to Schreier not being able to leave until they'd received feedback from the directors of the game. But the problem there was, well, the directors would typically be held up in meetings until 7 p.m. So, yeah, animators just, you know, end up being stuck, waiting for the work to be implemented, waiting for sign-offs, while, you know, artists end up reportedly having to share their workload in the hope of actually getting things done eventually. One developer surmises this approach by saying this: do this thing you weren't planning for, then do that other thing you weren't planning for, plus do what you were actually planned to do, right? That's the kind of problem going on here. Basically, the workload is too much and Naughty Dog is burning out staff. Now, what I'd say to all this is, you know, there's a pervasive thought that, oh, you know, back in the day, developers cared, they worked really hard, they slept in their office. But we got to be realistic. That's just a fairy tale fantasy. I mean, there are times where a bit of crunch ends up getting things done, but if it's sort of long-term and massive like this, then it's really inefficient. We're seeing that. We're seeing people say, look, this game could have been done a year ago if it was actually managed decently. I think what's happening here is they have this commitment to quality, but it's almost led to this self-fulfilling prophecy where the commitment to quality plus the not having a production team just means that crunch is the way that things get done. And that means that they're losing their staff. Now, if you think about a studio like BioWare, it has suffered from brain drain as people have left. Look at BioWare Austin. Lost a whole bunch of key staff. Where did they go? They went to Archetype, which is Wizards of the Coast's new RPG studio. You can really see how problems like this, how not managing crunch and designing work badly, how that can actually really hurt the core of a company, which at the end of the day is the staff, because you need staff working efficiently to actually get stuff done, instead of this situation where, yeah, stuff's just really late and probably at reduced quality. What I think is an even more interesting modifier in all that, though, is the recurring theme throughout all of these sources that Naughty Dog actually never explicitly ask people to crunch. Basically, it's expected. Staff feel obligated to be there because everyone else is there later. That's what people said. The studio purposefully targets workaholic types in its hiring practices, and it's basically searching for that type of perfectionist who will really dedicate themselves to, to the job without any question. And a bit of that is good. You need people who are passionate, who love what they're doing, but the thing is, if you end up exploiting that, then there's a bit of a problem. Now, Naughty Dog basically is just targeting the sort of people who, will crunch without being asked, and that's meant that this overtime is just ingrained in the company culture. It's a pretty unethical way to treat staff, but it's so normalized at Naughty Dog that, to a degree, people don't question it. It's just the norm. They're sort of just there because they think they should be there, but the thing is, as we found out, they have a lot of staff leaving, so obviously it's getting to the stage where the long-term downsides of that, like the long-term cost, really is being incurred. So this culture of crunch at Naughty Dog, it seems to exist for its own sake. It's the only way they know how to do things. But doesn't that sort of speak to something being wrong with their overarching management style? I would say yes, it does. Doesn't having, people to stay late, really late, to get a sign-off, does that not point to a need for more fluid governance? Crunch can work in short bursts. I agree with that, right? Who's ever pulled an all-nighter for a deadline, right? I get it, it happens. But if it's that long and that unsustainable, then it just means that studios like this are a ticking time bomb. I mean, even The Last of Us 2's delay didn't help alleviate pressures there. It just gave the staff time for even more crunch. Now, Schreier's article concludes by stating that there are some developers, including those still at Naughty Dog, who secretly hope that The Last of Us 2 will fail. The reason that crunch persists, right, is that in terms of the end product, it usually works for the company, right? The first Last of Us game, it was born out of that same culture of crunch, and it is one of the most revered games ever made, I would say. Now, its sequel being a critical flop, that could burst that crunch bubble for good and perhaps show Naughty Dog that maybe this is not the best way to actually make games. Perhaps, if staff are making themselves physically sick, there was one person who was just overworked massively and was hospitalized that we found out about, and so if people having that happen, they're seeing their children grow up around them, then maybe that's sacrifice just isn't worth it. And maybe those staff will leave, and maybe that will mean that future games in the studio will not be as good. And just to finish this off with a point, I get it, a lot of people don't really care about crunch. A lot of people will say, I think about my dad, right? My dad builds conservatories. That's what he did all the time, when I was growing up. And yeah, there'd be times, he'd go to site at 8 a.m., he'd leave site at 9 p.m. So I get that those things happen. Now, in fairness, his men didn't do that, and it was his business, so he was the leader doing those things. But yeah, a lot of people are going to think about other jobs where there ends up being a lot of work. But what I'd say is, right, with Naughty Dog, it's obviously got to the stage where they're losing staff. If they're not competitive hiring to the point where them, as a game studio, have got to hire animators from the film industry, I think it's very obvious how that's going to reduce the quality of their games and how this is not going to end up working out well. And I think, at least from the consumer perspective, even if it isn't empathy for staff that is going to rouse up consumers to this problem, perhaps it'll be games, being worse. And those problems that will actually get consumers to care about the issue. And, seems like Naughty Dog may just be the studio to actually show us that. I think really what we need to do is we need to wait and see. When Last of Us 2 comes out, we need to see how good the game is. I expect it probably will be very good, but more importantly, we need to wait until months after that to when the staff get their bonuses, and we need to see how many high-profile layoffs they had. If they had, right, that team of 20 designers, and they were down to 6 now, right, in terms of the people who left from Uncharted 4, what does that say across the entire studio, especially for these overstrained animation departments? We'll just have to wait and see. I would love to know, though, what do you think about this? One studio I'd love to know more about is Respawn. I wonder, how much crunch made Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Now, I know, it's not the most innovative game on the planet, but for me, it always just seemed like, it's safe in a whole bunch of ways in terms of its design, but it's just really damn well executed. And when I look at that game, I guess I just almost see a game that was timetabled and budgeted really well, that was managed really well, and just came out quite nicely. And I think that's what we need more of in the industry. So yeah, anyway, it'll be interesting to find out. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching this video, and with that, I'll see you next time.